In this episode of the Digital Trailblazer podcast, we're going to talk about how to take a boring, ordinary story and turn it into something exciting and impactful. So stay tuned.
If you want to build a legitimate, profitable online business without shiny objects, without the hypey gimmicks, and without the stress and overwhelm, if you want to make more money without having to be present online all day, every day, pumping out content that nobody sees and hustling DMs to generate leads and sales, then this is the place for you. Welcome to the Digital Trailblazer podcast, your online business university, where you'll learn how ordinary people start from ground zero with no influence, no email list or audience to sell to, and no business or marketing experience, and go from working 9-to-5 jobs to building successful 6- and 7-figure online businesses and all the steps in between. Learn the strategies that worked and what didn't. Learn the mistakes that they made and how to avoid them, and then learn their plans for scaling their businesses and taking things to the next level. All so that you can build your business faster and easier and make more money without sacrificing the things that are important to you in your life. I'm your host, Leah Ray Getz, and with me is my husband, Todd. Now, let's get to it with today's guest.
Welcome, Digital Trailblazers. My name is Todd Getz, your host of the Digital Trailblazer podcast. And with me today is Melissa Monte. Melissa, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and tell them what you do?
Yeah, my name is Melissa. I am the creator of 2 transformational brands, Mind Love, which is my podcast that I grew pretty quickly with the power of story. Within 6 months, I was speaking on stages on podcast growth with 0 audience to start or advertising. And since then, I've branched out into a program called Story Love, which helps people figure out, as you said, take their boring stories, or many people think they don't have a story, which I'll give you a hint is not true. We all have a story, and make it into something that aligns with your audience, pulls people in, makes them lean in and want to work with you.
Stories are so important in business, and I think a lot of people don't realize just how impactful these are. One of the things that we often say is that people make decisions based on emotion. Even people who are highly analytical, doctors, engineers, people like that, we still make decisions based on emotion, and then we use facts and logic and studies and whatever else we need to justify those decisions later on. Now, in order to invoke these emotions, the most powerful thing I think that we can use is stories, because in the minds of your audience, whenever you can help them to envision themselves in a situation, they start to feel the emotions of those things actually happening to them. And when they feel those emotions, that's when we can start to invoke the emotions that we need to generate sales and leads and things like that. So it's super important. And I know that we've used this in our business a lot, but I know especially early on in our business journey for me and my wife, the big problem we had is that we didn't think we were really anything special. Like, we hadn't done big things in our lives. We had just kind of taken a normal path of going to college, getting married, starting careers, and then, starting a business. And we didn't really see that we had a big rags to riches story, or we hadn't hit rock bottom and come back up from that, or, we didn't have something big and impactful and exciting. And I think a lot of other people are probably in the same situation. So how do you take a story that you feel is really not that exciting and make it something that can actually invoke these emotions and build your business?
Well, the first thing I want to say, for someone who thinks they don't have a story or their life isn't exciting enough, you're just normalizing your own wisdom. And we all do that. We've all picked up wisdom along our life experiences. And because it's normal to us, we just sort of brush it off. We have all heard other people's boring stories, but when it's told well, when it's told with emotion and resonance, and you're trying to align with the person that you're telling the story to, that's when something that could be a boring kitchen moment, a realization in a car, a turning point after a conversation with your boss. If you are able to step back and actually see the wisdom that you've developed from that and know how it's moved you through your life, that's when your story becomes gold. And so one of the biggest problems that people make is believing that their story is about them. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but when you're trying to share to connect, the story is really about this common point. And so you have to make it about the audience member. And when you do that, then you are less likely to overshare every detail. You're less likely to think that trauma dumping is impact, because the truth is a good story isn't just what happened to you. It's about what your audience sees in themselves because of what you learned. And so when you can take that, that's the shift. And so I do have a 7-step outline that I work with all sorts of people. And usually I have two types of people that come to me. It's the people who don't think they have a story, or it's the people who think their story is too big, too crazy that it's unrelatable. That's kind of the bucket I fell into. But regardless of where you're coming from, through the 7-step outline that pulls in things like, what were the beliefs you inherited? What was the big disruption in your life? And so on, and all the way to the wisdom that you get. And I can go into more detail if you'd like, but those steps help you to see your story through a different lens, which everybody I've worked with on this has then seen their story and they're like, oh my gosh, it brings people to tears. It moves them hearing their own story from a different way. And so sometimes we just need a new perspective.
Yeah. A couple of things that you just mentioned there that really kind of stood out to me. Number one was the trauma dumping. And then the other thing was the oversharing, because those are two things I see so much whenever I attend a webinar or challenge or anything where within the script, there's this part where you got to tell your story. And I think a lot of people don't really understand the purpose of the story. And that's part of maybe why they do the trauma dumping and the oversharing, is they're not really sure what's relevant, what should be said, what shouldn't be said. How do we pick and choose what parts of our story to tell and what not to tell? So maybe let's just dive into that first. Like, how do you know if you're oversharing? How do you know if something that is part of your story is something you should actually tell on a webinar or something?
People don't need to know every single thing that got you somewhere. And a lot of times when we don't have clarity on our own stories, we're not sure which things matter. And so that's why we put in too much. Another thing is, I used to be a trauma dumper, and I did it in a protective way. I actually used to just go big with the things that had happened to me, and it kept a wall up. I would say it very stoically for the shock factor almost. And I would get people interested. They were interesting stories. I had a crazy life. I went to jail for somebody else's crime when I was 22. I got a felony at that age. I launched my digital marketing career because I didn't want to have to say that on 2 lines of a job application. So I have a big story, but I would just I'd be at a party and be like, I mean, I have a felony, don't you? Just in this way to kind of be the entertainment. But it kept people at an arm's length. It wasn't creating any sort of connection. And so when I started sharing my podcast, I had done a lot of work towards that. And so what I learned along the way is a lot of times the deep details of your trauma aren't necessary for someone to understand the transformation. And so you have to be aware of the narrative arc that you're bringing people through. Look at the contrast. Are you bringing people down too long to where it's going to be hard for them to recover? If they can't recover, they're going to be worried about if you're okay, and they're not going to be able to see the wisdom that you've gained from it and thus your expertise. So you need to tread lightly there. Where you go into deep detail is actually usually the turning point. It's what I call the awakening, seeing the pattern for what it is. And so I mentioned the first 2 steps of my 7-step framework. First is the algorithm, getting clear on what you were taught about success or love or worth or identity, and in relation to your area of expertise, to your mission of why you're sharing this. And so these are all recurring experiences that shaped beliefs about yourself. You can ask yourself something like, if your life was a movie, what was the main storyline? If you had to summarize your past and patterns in a single phrase, what would that be? So these are all ways to get insight into that. The second part is the disruption. A lot of times this is that big trauma. What's the moment that made you realize something wasn't what you thought? For me, it was my big trauma, but it's not for everybody. Sometimes it can be I worked with a woman who worked in real estate, and her story that she's sharing is how she left real estate, how it wasn't fulfilling, how she was afraid of being able to replace her income, things like that. And for her, it was the moment she was sitting in the car, her knuckles gripping the steering wheel, realizing she was having anxiety about walking into the workplace. So that was her big disruption. Mine was being arrested for someone else's crime. They can vary greatly. And so you only really have to worry about going too deep into it if it's a traumatic experience that might make the audience not okay. Then there's the awakening, seeing the pattern for what it is. What was the exact moment that you saw the pattern? Hold on, I have been ignoring this nudge about my job for 7 years, thinking it's going to change if I make more money, and it still hasn't. What is that pattern? For me, it was self-abandonment, realizing I would move cities to get away from conflict, and then I would just change my personality to fit in. I was giving everything to everyone, and I didn't even know myself. Once you see that, Where most people live the longest is in the resistance. It's that battle between old and new. This is stage 4. If we all could just embody our wisdom the moment that we saw it, like, okay, I'm going to make different life choices. I'm going to only do what lights me up. We'd all be practically enlightened here. But no, there's like, well, how do I let go of this income or the relationship? Hold on, I live with him. He's half my income. Like all these different things. Or I just can't get myself to work out every day. What is that resistance that makes it really hard to step into this new way of being, step into the person that you want to be? But eventually we get tired of that resistance. We get tired of that back and forth. We're like, no, I'm going to make the choice. Step 5. This is that commitment to change. What was the exact moment you decided to change for real? What actions proved to yourself that this time was different? What did it feel like to step into this new version of you? And that leads to the embodiment. This is the actions and habits or the choices that solidified your big change. How did people react to the new you? And some of these stages might overlap with each other, but it's seeing it from different perspectives. And finally, step 7 is the gold. This is the deeper meaning and the patterns. This is why you are an expert in what you have overcome. And so when you know all of these, suddenly you're seeing your pattern, your story through a different narrative arc. You're bringing yourself through what you started as, what that big thing was, the awakening. When you see it this way, suddenly it's much easier to tell your story because you're not getting caught in the little details. And what I've also found is this process has actually helped people heal from parts of their story that they didn't even know they were still holding on to, because they're finally able to connect that pain with the wisdom that they've gained and they feel like they've overcome it. Now, one side note is this isn't just for big traumatic things or for transformational coaches. I've worked with somebody who moved from web design to AI, and he told that story in this way. What did he understand about the way he needed to work? How did AI disrupt that? You can use it with really any type of business, and it'll show you exactly how to connect with your audience. And this isn't new. This 7-stage framework is very aligned with the hero's journey, which every movie, book, anything is really based on. But where it adds a little depth is, as you said in the beginning, we make decisions based on emotion. And because I've worked with emotion so much in my career, I understand how to create that resonance where you basically make your audience vibe with you. You're resonating. So doing it this way, adding just a little more depth, regardless if you're telling your business arc or your trauma arc, that is what makes people lean in and say, oh, I see myself in you, or you feel like you're in my head. And it makes people choose you over the thousands of other people doing the same thing.
Yeah, as you were kind of going through that, I was, like you said, the hero's journey, I was thinking, oh, this is similar, but it's different. And to me, like you said, it's deeper. For example, when you're describing the disruption, immediately in my mind, it went back to a moment in my life where I was making the transition from being a public school teacher to now working in a corporate setting. In order to make that transition, I was actually teaching doctors how to use computers, their electronic health records. And for me, that was a big wake-up call for me, because I realized at that point when I started working closely with doctors that doctors are no different from you and me. I used to think that they were very special, that you had to have a very high level of intelligence and you had to have special skill, and it was something that was just unattainable. And when I started actually working with doctors and teaching them how to use computers and seeing them out of their element and how they were trying to adapt to that, I realized that, my goodness, these people are just like you and me. The only difference was that they put in the work to be a doctor. That was the difference. And if you were just willing to do the work to do something, you could do whatever you wanted. And that was kind of the point in my life where I realized that many, many other things were possible other than what I was just doing. And it really opened up a lot of doors for us later on. That's probably one part of our story that I would tell to formulate our journey. And this formula that you've got, what kind of stood out to me is that you're just taking one thing that happened in your life that exemplifies that. Is that right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. And so depending on the length of your story, this can be used for, your podcast intro. Somebody says, oh, how did you get started in what you're doing? It can be that 3 to 7 minute story that people share regularly. But you can also expand that out to be a 45-minute keynote. And the only difference is each of these stages, I call it the accordion method, you just expand out each of the stages and almost go through the 7 steps in there just a little more lightly. And so then you're creating these. Bill Gove, one of the OG public speakers, he taught the greats like Wayne Dyer and whatnot. He calls these little points in your life vignettes. And so it's just how much you're expanding or contracting the vignettes. So for a shorter story, yeah, you just sort of touch on it and you go deep, usually in that awakening part, that like, or that the really visceral realization more so than the trauma. And so instead of going deep into how I was taken advantage of or whatever your big trauma is, instead it could be like sitting there with your coffee cup, talking about the steam, what's going through your mind. Those are the parts that you really go into, because what you do is you create a mini realization. You help your audience see and feel it so deeply that they begin that transformation. So when they hear the rest of your story, now they're resonating with you and they want to continue what they were just going through emotionally. So that's why it works so well.
The other thing that you mentioned, and you've been touching upon throughout everything you're saying, is that you don't need to have that big traumatic moment. It doesn't have to be this wild ride of a life that you've lived in order to tell a good story. And that the more important thing is the relatability to your audience. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. As I said, every single person has a story. They probably have 5 to 10 that they could say in different perspectives, depending on what their mission is, what their ideal audience is, and the kind of impact that they want to create. Everybody has a story. And so that's what we find through some of the tools, whether it's going through the worksheet that I just outlined for you guys or plugging it into some of the custom AI tools that I've developed to make finding those threads easier.
How do you know if your story is going to be relatable or not? Or is there a way to take any part of your life and make it relatable to an audience? How do you make that transition?
Anyone can make a story relatable. And so it takes understanding those 7 steps of yourself and who you want to work with. Sometimes people don't realize they actually still have choice there. I might look at my story and see 6 different threads of self-abandonment to self-worth, finding my voice, of starting my business, of speaking up in a room full of men. There's a bunch of things that I've gone through, and most people have. Saying it that way, people probably relate to those already. And so the trick is, when we go through these 7 steps, we find those emotional shifts, the broader theme threads that everyone relates to. So yes, we wrap it in our specifics, but because we're always bringing it back to that emotional shift, that's when somebody can hear I went to jail for somebody else's crime, but they relate to the self-abandonment. They relate to putting other people before themselves in relationship. They relate to ignoring their own red flags. And so when you're making a point and wrapping it in narrative, what they're resonating with is that point, regardless of how so-called boring, mundane, or outlandish your specifics are in your narrative.
Now, one of the other things that you mentioned is that you can make this a very short story or a very long story. I feel like people typically have problems with making things shorter rather than longer. So let's start with that. How do you take a story and make it short and concise? And specifically, what I'm thinking about is during a webinar. Whenever I see people script out a webinar and I start reading through this, I ask them, okay, did you time it? At what point do we get to the actual training? And how long are we spending on your story? Typically, they're spending way too long on their story. And we need to cut it down to maybe 1/3 or 1/2 of what it is in order to make it fit so that people don't get bored and just check out of the webinar. What are some tips that you can give people to really boil down a story to the most impactful parts and still follow this formula?
Well, when you're trying to make it as short as possible, you've got to understand what platform that's on. So you gave the example of the webinar. People are not in the webinar for you. They are in the webinar to learn something else. But we tell our stories because we want to show why we're important to listen to. We want to say, okay, no, this is the best person to listen to, so that they have that mindset for the rest of the thing. So what I do is I kind of condense down those 7 steps. But because it's a shorter form, you got to think in terms of, you don't just start with your algorithm like, oh, I grew up thinking this. What's your hook? We should all know what a hook is by now, especially in business. We know that everyone's scrolling through things. I argue that our attention span isn't as small as people think because people are also listening to 3.5 hour podcasts, but it depends on where they are, what they're expecting to pay attention to. If they're tuning into Joe Rogan versus scrolling on TikTok, it's going to be a different mindset. But you really think about that hook, something that's powerful, slightly polarizing, mysterious. It should make people immediately stop and think. You can still use those in things like a webinar, especially because oftentimes those stories feel like a pattern interrupt. But you're still taking those pieces of that 7 steps. The way I like to outline when you're adapting it to short form is you want your hook, you want your perspective shift, which is the aha moment. It's basically a way of wrapping up your awakening I talked about. The big idea, the core insight, and turning that awareness into power. And so you want to follow that same arc, but just make it highly relevant to the topic there. And you kind of wrap it in your whatever skills you've learned from being on Instagram all of these years. Like, how are you going to catch them and immediately tell them it's relatable while keeping your points short? You can still bring forward that moment, though. What is that moment of the awakening? That's that big shift. Make people see and feel it, because you don't need to tell all of your story with that level of depth, but you want them to at least be able to really visualize and feel one part of it. That's what's going to spark that emotional transformation. And so then they can hear the rest and be excited to learn from you.
I think one of the things that I see happen a lot is that people are starting just way too early in their lives, and they've it's like,
You're like, dude, you're 22. No. What do you know about relationships?
yeah, well, it's like if I'm giving a webinar about a business strategy I learned, and I start telling my story, and then I'm starting, I grew up as a young boy on an 80-acre farm in rural Wisconsin, and as I was growing up on that farm, and blah 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 blah, and so I see a lot of people just kind of starting way too early in their lives, and I think what happens is people wonder, well, why is this relevant? Why do I even care? Just I came here to learn about Facebook ads, and so I think one of the things that for me, learning to tell my own story was learning how to just jump into the middle of it where it's super relevant right from the beginning. Am I hitting on the right thing to do there, or?
Yes. In my program, I actually have, I have a hook generator, but I also have a whole list of different ways to hook. And as you just said, that sort of jumping right into the meat of it is often a way to do that. And sometimes you start there and then you go back to any relevant details. But you can also look at different ways of framing this. Like, ask yourself, okay, if I'm starting there, if for some reason I feel something about rural Wisconsin being relevant to my story, can I turn that around right away? I wouldn't say this is the best way to do it, but it is a way that would work even better than that. How many of you guys grew up in the middle of nowhere and didn't have the benefit of being in the Los Angeles tech kingdom or something like that, where you kind of start there, you're bringing people in, or why did you feel that part is relevant? What is it about this first part that you feel like you need to share? Know why you're telling every detail of your story. And sometimes just that knowledge will help you frame it in a way that is relevant. Maybe it's, how many of you don't think you're techie enough to do what I'm about to show you, and you're just wondering if you're going to get to the end of this? Ask them a question, bring them in. I thought that too. Actually, I just started last year with no training. And then you bring them through an arc of how you got from that common belief, which is likely going to be an objection or a worry that somebody has about working with you or doing what you're about to share with them. And then you bring just that transformation that you also did. And Russell Brunson calls it the epiphany bridge. I feel like his framework is a little salesier than I feel like works nowadays, but it's that same concept. What is the transformation you're going to bring your ideal audience to? And how do you tease yours so that they see that it's possible through you?
I like how you took that example that I gave and made it relevant. That was something I didn't expect.
What I do here.
Yeah, I know. And that's kind of the neat thing and I think that's where the skill comes in too, is just recognizing how to take a part of a story that you think may not be relevant or that you think may not be impactful, and how do you frame it in a way that makes it relatable to your audience. And that's a skill that I think just comes with practice and maybe comes through a few revisions and doing this over and over. So one of the other things that we often talk about is using stories to answer questions, because there's a lot of ways to use stories. One is there's a whole section of your webinar where you're supposed to tell the story. But even in Q&A, or I've seen really good marketers do this, where somebody will ask a question and they'll answer with a story. And it's not a big, long story. It's just a little short thing that makes it relatable, but it makes it memorable. Is there a different formula that you would use to answer questions or for different parts of any conversation that you might have with a prospect? Are there different versions of this for that, or are you still following these same 7 steps?
I really love the 7 steps to pull out your main theme. And then I have a framework to branch off from there. And so after we're figuring out what your core story is and who your ideal audience is, some people don't know their ideal audience and they're using their story to point to that. Other people know their audience, they might even know their business, and they're trying to figure out how to map their story together. Either way, this works. But from there, when you know who your audience is and what your story is, what I like to do is create what's called the story bank. So when I help people find their audiences, I want them to know what they're selling, to know what people may even be searching for, but what is the shadow desire underneath that? And so people might think they want to start a business when that shadow desire is actually to prove their mom that they can actually be successful, or feel like they've made something of themselves on their own, or not feel like they're working for somebody else's dream. There's always something underneath, and it's usually multiple. So when you have those shadow desires, you can actually connect a lot of different stories from there. So in my program, I have a tool that will help with prompts to kind of pull those out. But this comes back to what I shared earlier about Bill Gove talking about vignettes. So when I took a public speaking program, heroic public speaking, they also encourage you to have a bunch of mini stories on hand that you can adapt to different things. And so I have a running document for whatever program is forefront of my mind. The biggest questions that tend to come up are what people want to know. And then I'll just map little bullet point stories to that. You don't need to have the whole thing scripted out, but sometimes it's good to also have maybe a little hook with that story, or maybe a couple of details that you don't want to miss, or a signature line. I encourage people to have impactful lines within their stories. So they don't need to know the story perfectly, but if they know how they're introing that and that mic drop ending that they're going to have, it really leaves a mark, even if the rest of it is a little all over the place. People remember the beginning and the end. And so the level of preparedness depends on your goals. If you're trying to be a public speaker, really hone 10 stories to start. Bill Gove said that you can build an entire 50-year career off of 20 good stories. You don't need a ton. You just need to know them so well that you become really good at adapting them based on the situation. If you're just trying to be on more podcasts or get yourself out there, do more reels, you can just have some running bullet points that you keep up next to you when people are asking you questions. But even just that level of preparedness can totally change the way you're portrayed on a show.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because I think about some of the most memorable guests that we've had on our show, and it was all because they had these stories that they were telling that were super interesting, very relevant. And for me, I know that the point where I realized that storytelling was super important and that if I wanted to make more money, I needed to get good at this, was when I attended an event and I got to sit down at a table with a multiple 7-figure earner. And at the time, I think I was making like low 6 figures, but it was this mastermind sort of situation where people were just asking him questions. But what I realized was that every time somebody asked a question, he had a story to tell with it. And I still remember those stories that he told. And that was several years ago. What was it? Probably 7 years ago that this happened. And I still remember the stories. And I remember thinking at that time that this is one of the big things that this guy does different that I am not doing, and that other people who are not as successful are not doing either. And so that's when I really started to lean into this whole storytelling idea and get into the psychology of things. So I know that this is super important in people's businesses. And if they can master this and even just learn how to tell these short stories to answer questions and be more memorable, to stand out, because that's one of the other ways you can really just stand out from the competition. Grabbing people's attention and being memorable is so important because everything is saturated now. I don't know that there's a single niche out there where it's not saturated. And there's so much content being pumped out on the internet that you really got to go that extra mile to really stand out. And I think this, if you can do this, this is the way to do it. So if people want to learn more about you and what you do and maybe get some help with this, how can they find you online?
Yeah, you can find me at mindlove.com or on Instagram at mindlovemelissa. And I also have a free tool if they're interested in seeing what it looks like to reframe a story that they might not see any purpose in, or maybe it's something that is still holding them back in some way, you can go to mindlove.com/story. And what you're going to do is it's just a short form that you fill out. You can fill it out in 1 word per question or as many details as you want to give. And it'll email you with a personalized reframe that's unlike any of the other responses. I've created this tool with AI. So it'll give you a reframe of how to look for that story from a different perspective.
Awesome. That sounds really neat. I would say definitely check that out. We'll have the links for that and everything else in the show notes. So everybody be sure to check those out. Melissa, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. We really enjoyed having you here with us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Digital Trailblazer podcast. For show notes and information about today's guest, head to digitaltrailblazer.com. Now, if you love this episode, if you got some value, make sure you leave us a review and subscribe. And be sure to share this episode with anyone you know who could use help to build their business. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.